Thanks, Lorraine. So, as Lorraine has said, our key purpose today is really to try and provide a whistle-stop tour, so to speak, of the regulations for medical devices that are set out at European level. There's about 300 odd pages of fairly dense regulatory text, which obviously means an awful lot to us from the point of view of the legislation and the regulation, but interpreting that, putting it into play in practice, making it actually something that's useful and valuable for patients, for healthcare delivery, for public health, is really what our main purpose is today. So what we want to do is try and extract some of the things that we think are really important to know about. We're conscious that, of course, there's a huge amount of experience with medical devices already in the room. There's a huge amount of experience with regulation and CE marking and all of the different compliance checks that there might be. But I suppose we really want to build on that and start to work through some of the practical challenges that you see in your day-to-day practice, in your day-to-day service delivery, to make sure, I suppose, that what we can do is afford useful advice, useful information, and target the areas, both from the point of view of our information and from the point of view of our work, to make sure that what the regulation is doing is adding value and protecting patients. The medical device regulations, as I say, set out at EU, and Nicola will cover some more detail on them. The medical device regulation and the in vitro diagnostics regulation were agreed back in 2017 and then started to come into application in 2021 and 2022 respectively. And they brought about, I would say, significant improvements in what was there before, the existing directives, the legislation that governed medical devices before that time, to strengthen the system, to identify some of the gaps that there were maybe in the directives, and also to recognise that technology had advanced quite a bit since the directives were defined originally in the 1990s. So it was felt that a legislative update was really important. But one of the things that I think is really key for today is that the regulations, MDR and IVDR, more or less for the first time, started to make fairly explicit obligations and provisions for healthcare providers, for health systems, for healthcare institutions, and really that's why we're here today. Sorry, this is a good start. So what I wanted to do then was, as a starting point, to make a list, as regulators love to do, of the things that we see in the regulations that are probably of primary importance for health systems. And of course, regulators are also tied up in words all the time, so the title of this slide originally was Requirements for Health Systems, but not all of these are requirements. Some of them are things to encourage health systems to do. So using devices that are compliant with the regulations, typically CE marked medical devices. There are provisions in the regulations for health systems to afford traceability systems, particularly for implanted products. There are good practices for distributors of medical devices outlined in the regulations, and some of those types of obligations or practices may come into health systems in various different models and various different configurations. There's a variety of different pieces of patient information which healthcare providers have to convey on to patients, like implant cards, like statements relating to custom-made medical devices. The regulation also encourages healthcare practitioners and healthcare professionals, and Paddy will cover it in the last presentation today, to report safety issues when they occur, incident reporting as we call it. And member states, competent authorities are encouraged to work with health systems and healthcare providers to encourage better reporting systems. There are also provisions around reprocessing of single-use medical devices, provisions around clinical investigations and performance studies of new medical devices, so effectively clinical trials or clinical research, provisions around in-house manufacturing, provisions around compassionate use of medical devices, so when a patient is, a single patient needs a medical device on a compassionate grounds. It also encourages things that are very useful, I suppose, to monitor the long-term safety of medical devices, so implementing registries and things like that. But again, that's one of the things that it's not a requirement, it's something that's encouraged at member state and at healthcare professional level. There are also provisions in the IVDR around genetic testing, particularly in the area of counselling and consent. And more recently, because of the transition to the legislation, to the new legislation under the regulations, specific legislation has been introduced to deal with potential disruptions to supply. Much of that can be arising from the transition to the new regulation. We're not going to talk about all of that today because it's a big list, but we're going to draw out attention to these specific things which will be covered off during the agenda today. At the HPRA, we're clearly focused on trying to ensure that regulation adds value, that Lorraine has said it's not seen as a burden. It's something that has to overall achieve the objective of protecting public health, making patients safe, but also providing them with medical devices that are going to help them, so allowing innovation to happen and allowing access to new technologies. And also, as Lorraine mentioned, health system partnerships for us is key. It's one of our key strategic goals at HPRA in our outgoing strategic plan, which is due to finish up at the end of this year, and it's front and centre in our new strategic plan to be announced shortly. Those health system partnerships, as Lorraine said, are really important for medical devices because, distinct to medicines, the user is so important as to how a medical device is used, how it's used safely, the location in which it's used. So getting your insight and getting your experience and having that type of channel of dialogue between you and us is really, really important for all of us so that we can make sure that medical devices are safe in practice. So moving on to the agenda for today, as I say, what we want to do is try and walk through the life cycle of a medical device and highlight some of the important things to be aware of to ensure that you can meet the requirements of the regulation in different scenarios. Nicola will start off, our regulatory and policy manager, to provide an overview of the regulatory system, CE marking, the different actors, the role of the HPRA, and some of the different obligations on health institutions. And I guess the objective of that session is to have an understanding of how devices are regulated, the role of the HPRA, what the health institution and your role is in using devices in healthcare settings, and how to ensure that they're compliant on an ongoing basis. That'll be followed then by a presentation from Donal O'Connor, our clinical manager, who'll give an overview of some of the provisions around clinical research of medical devices and in vitro diagnostics, and also those compassionate use type of applications, with the objective of having an understanding of how devices that aren't yet CE marked, or maybe in development or in research, how they can be brought into clinical practice and the obligations that there are on us to assess and approve those, and also on health systems to make sure that they're deployed safely and in line with things like good clinical practice. We'll follow that with a panel discussion, which will include Nicola, Paddy, myself, and Donal, Paddy Murphy, our assessment and surveillance manager. And that'll discuss scenarios where non-CE marked devices may be used. Obviously, our focus today is really on the mainstream, the CE mark, the 95% of medical device use, but there are exceptions to that, where sometimes medical devices can be used that don't have a CE mark, either on a routine basis or sometimes in very exceptional circumstances. And our objective in that is to try and understand the circumstances when a device isn't CE marked, what the regulatory provisions and requirements are around that. Before coffee, we'll have a Q&A session. And then after the coffee in the early afternoon, Paddy Murphy, our assessment and surveillance manager, whose team looks after all of the post-market aspects relating to medical devices primarily, vigilance reporting, field safety corrective actions, and some of the things that are really important to make sure that medical devices continue to be safe. He'll overview those in his presentation, with the objectives of making sure that there's an understanding of how devices on the market are monitored, primarily by the manufacturers, but also by authorities and indeed by health institutions, to understand the legal responsibilities that manufacturers have to report, so that you know when reporting to a manufacturer what their obligation is on to report to us, to understand what we do when we receive a report from a manufacturer in relation to a safety issue, and to understand, I guess, how we would hope to engage best with healthcare professionals and health systems to ensure effective post-market monitoring, to ensure effective safety monitoring of medical devices in practice. We'll close with, I suppose, a wrap-up Q&A, and then at the end of the meeting, what we would intend to do, because we're conscious that sometimes people prefer to ask questions in a bilateral way. So what we were intending to do at the end was to set up a few stations with the different presenters, so that if people want to ask questions bilaterally, they can do so following on from the meeting. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Nicola, who will give you the first presentation in relation to the overview. Thanks.